We bailed on these 20-year allies, and we left them to be executed in the dirt. I said to myself, I can't be part of this. His cell phone was on 10% power. We made a phone call into just a random number. You got to give him the password. And we're like, what's the password? And he said, it put me in a very, very dark place. And by 2015, I was standing in a closet holding a pistol. Had my son not come home from school when he did, I wouldn't be here. I can tell you right now. The bin Laden brand is back. We are facing a terror threat on our homeland that's going to make 9/11 look like a dress rehearsal.
Scott, what's going on, man?
Hey, thanks for having me on, Nick.
Hey, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to talk to you today for a number of reasons. One is just all the crazy stuff that's going on in the world.
Yeah.
But first, I'd like to maybe hop in a little time machine and ask you, what's the most important piece of advice you would give to Lieutenant Mann that was in the military long ago?
Well, I would have supported. I think I did a decent job about it, but I would reiterate listening to your NCOs and really just listen to them and learn from them. You know, that was something that I learned as a young guy anyway, but there were times when I could have listened better, and they usually were times when things went south. So that's probably what I would say.
So listen to those non-commissioned officers, people that have probably been in the fight a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
You have your background's in special operations. You served in 7th Group. There's a huge push. Maybe, I don't know if it's more recently, I've just noticed a larger push for people studying irregular warfare. There's been a lot more interest in it. Maybe it's because of what's happened in Afghanistan. But what's a lesson that maybe sticks out to you from your career about that you could provide to anyone that's just studying this crazy irregular warfare topic?
I think, whether there's irregular warfare, there's unconventional warfare, there's asymmetric warfare. I say go local or go home. When you're dealing with complex threats and irregular threats, the reality is that at the heart of all of it is human behavior, and that is usually primal in nature. And understanding just timeless realities of human behavior is that all things are local. You know, if you walk something back to its origins and you don't have an appreciation of the local context, then you're not relevant to the problem. And even if you come in and whack a bunch of targets or whatever, in effect, if you don't understand what's actually driving that threat to, for example, in the case of Islamist violent extremism, pursue a multi-century narrative, then you're irrelevant to the problem. And so when you pursue irregular warfare and a study of it, I think is a much deeper appreciation for local realities, especially when they're different than yours.
And you were deployed to Afghanistan. You also went back as a civilian. Is that right? For the extraction, were you back there?
I didn't go back. No,
you organized.
I was involved in the withdrawal in a very informal way, in the sense that we stood up a group of veterans who basically used cell phones and relationships to try to get as many out as we could in informal partnerships with the actual non-combatant evacuation force.
I got you. And that's really interesting to me from an intelligence perspective, that normally you would rely on these big agencies to do these types of things. But yeah, you were helping an organization of just regular people that said, this is crazy what's happening in Afghanistan. We've been there for years and we're just going to leave people. Can you
Yeah.
maybe just touch on that about like why did you get involved with that? Like what were the emotions behind that?
Yeah, I left. I spent 20 almost 23 years in the army, and about 18 of that as a Green Beret, and 3 tours in Afghanistan and some shorter trips over there as well. And I left. I retired in 2013 as a lieutenant colonel, and I turned down 3 battalion commands in the process because I just didn't like where things were going. I didn't like
Mm,
the way that we were operating in Afghanistan. I had been heavily involved in standing up a program called Village Stability Operations, which is kind of a modern day Magnificent Seven, where we returned back to our roots instead of kicking in doors and this being special forces. And driving to work from our built up fire bases, we actually immersed ourselves in the local communities and helped them stand up on their own. And it was a very successful program for almost 2 years. And then after we had made promises to these elders and to these leaders at community levels, we bailed on them. Because of a top-down directive, we changed the plan and we moved back onto the fire bases, and we basically left them to be hunted and killed. And to me, it was a foreshadowing of what I knew was coming. Like when we did that,
right.
I said to myself, I can't be part of this. Like I'm no longer, I just can't live with that. And so a lot of the elders I recruited were killed. And I got out and got outside the military industrial realm and really focused on, nonprofit work, human connection work, storytelling, speaking from the stage, even wrote a play about the war. And that's kind of what I was doing 10 years later when my friend Nizam, who was an Afghan commando, special forces guy, and graduate of our Q course at Fort Bragg,
Wow.
was
Yeah.
on the run and was being hunted by the Taliban as the country collapsed in August of 2021. And no one was coming. Like it was astounding
Right.
to me, but like here was a guy who had not only graduated from the U.S. or the Afghan version of Special Forces, he was a Q course graduate. Like he was part of
Yeah.
our regiment, and
Yeah.
there was only a handful of those guys, and nobody was even tracking him or trying to get him
Mm,
out. No one thought, "Wow, what would it mean if ISIS or Iran rolled up a Q course graduate who's an Afghan?
right. You know,
Maybe we should take some risk and get him out." None of that. They didn't even know. They weren't even tracking him as a guy that was on the run. And so it really, for me, I hadn't been in the game in a long time. It was kind of a shit show in the sense that I didn't really know what to do other than call friends who knew him, and together we just tried to treat it like a remote operation. Where you had, okay, we've got dudes on the ground. Who do we know? And how can we help? Who do we know that can help him move and just keep him safe? How can we just be a lifeline for him? How can we use technology to just collaborate, and when we hear about a checkpoint, is to drop a pin so that we can be his
mhm,
eyes and ears. And that's what we did for about 4 or 5 days without sleeping. And other, unbeknownst to us, other groups were doing the same thing when those calls came in. And so ultimately, right as he was about to be kicked out and his cell phone was on 10% power, we made a phone call into a phone number that we had been given, like on just a random number. And the first name was JP. And he was a State Department guy. And we thought, okay, well, we don't know him, but if he, theoretically a State Department guy could say, let him in because it's a State Department
yeah,
evac.
yeah, yeah.
And we got JP on the line and explained everything, and you could tell he was just exhausted. But when we talked about Nizam going to the Q course, and oh, by the way, he'd been shot through the face defending U.S. Green Berets and went
Mm,
right back into battle 5 weeks later with a set of U.S. made dentures. We told him all this.
jeez.
And JP said, "Oh, wow, did I tell you guys I was a Green Beret before I was State Department?" And we, no. And he said, "Okay, they're going to throw him out, but you got to give him the password." And we're like, "What's the password?" And he said, "Pineapple." And so we're screaming
There you
at him to
go.
say pineapple, and he did, and got through. And then phones just started blowing up when once they heard that
Right.
he got out. Other buddies were calling, and so we became Task Force Pineapple. And the mechanism that we used to get guys out was called the Pineapple Express. And over the next 6 days or so, we got around somewhere between 750 and 1,000 out.
Jeez.
with the help, obviously, of active duty members on the airfield. And a lot of other groups did this too.
Sure.
But that started, Nick, a process by which a lot of us, as former special operators in the global war on terror, were brought back into the fold in the wake of a 20-year war. Like, so we found
Right.
ourselves still on the phone with these allies, with these highly placed commandos and intel operatives that had, 99% of our intel was abandoned by the agency. I'm sorry, but it was.
Mhm.
100% of our partner force was abandoned by the DoD. And now all of a sudden you've got these GWAT veterans who are paying for safe houses. They're paying for babies to be born through midwives. We're doing food drops and medical drops, and moving these guys around like a shell game. And this has gone on for 4 years. And so that's where we are today. And now, with all those highly placed resources, are now giving high fidelity information to these
Right.
veterans groups who are storing it on their MacBooks and iPhones. It's like the Twilight Zone.
I mean, that's a great way to put it. It is like the Twilight Zone. Like you wouldn't think that. You'd think, man, that whole situation, the withdrawal, was just such a pathetic display of American exceptionalism that I'm so embarrassed by it just as an American. Um, I also had, I was in Afghanistan. I was a contractor when I was there. But during, working as a contractor, I own a company. I have people in Afghanistan that have helped me because you needed to have business licenses, and we have people deploying over there, and we have a lot of people that help, just make your operations run, whether that's supporting special operators or whatever military element. There were people that I was getting these texts too, and these calls, people saying, "Please help me. My family and I are in danger. Like, we help. I'm here. Get me out." And at the time, I had no idea what to do. Really, I had no idea. I didn't even know that the Task Force Pineapple existed. But I had one guy's name's Mustafa. He helped us a lot with our business licensing and things like that. And he was just begging me every day, like, "Please help, please help." I had no idea where to turn. I had no clue. I Googled. I did everything I could to figure out how to get this guy out. I ended up doing a bunch of paperwork, right? Like the USCIS paperwork. I filled out all these things. Handed over all my information, and he went silent for a while, and I was like, "Shit, man! Like
No.
this, he's toast." Like, because he was helping out U.S. forces over there. He's toast. And then, just randomly, about 6 months later, he calls me. He's like,
Hmm.
"I made it, man.
Oh,
Like,
thank God.
your paperwork you did helped out." And I was like, "Really?" I had
Yeah.
no idea.
Wow.
And um, if I would have known that there was another mechanism, I would have been like, "Hey, Scott, what do we do, man? Like, help me out.
Yeah.
Let me
It,
get this guy out."
I get it, and there was no way to know. Honestly,
Yeah,
even our group stood up organically. And, everybody was in signal, and it was like,
yeah,
I tell people, it was like looking at an evacuation or a catastrophe through a soda straw from 30,000 feet. Like, it was
yeah.
all discovery, learning, bumping around in the dark. So, by no congratulations for getting him out or helping him get out. But I will tell you, imagine what you would have felt if you got a video or a picture of him
Mm,
being killed.
no,
Right.
no,
Well, that's what's happened
yeah,
to thousands of our global war on terror veterans. They not only, so they felt exactly what you're like. It all comes down to relationships. And this is where, man, I really hope, like, what I'm about to say is heard by, I'd love to say it to President Trump's face and anybody else in the administration, um, to help them understand what it is they're walking into, but you got these veterans, these diplomats, others who, like you, who were contractors. Everything we did in that war in Afghanistan and Iraq was based on relationships. In fact, the whole phrase in Afghanistan was "Shona Bashona," this Dari phrase for shoulder to shoulder, and it was all a bunch of bullshit, right? When it all came down to it, it wasn't shoulder to shoulder at all. It was like, hold the door, I'm out. And so we bailed on these 20-year allies, and we left them to be executed in the dirt. And a whole bunch of veterans and others who had served there, they just weren't good with it. That like that's not the way our parents raised us. It's not what we were told to do in the deployments. We were held to a standard of you never leave an ally. You eat what they eat, you sleep where they sleep. And all of a sudden now you're just leaving them, because it's time to go. And so you had all of remember a lot of these are men and women who had massive injuries,
Mhm.
both internal and external. They had struggled to put the war behind them. They did what their country asked them to do. Many of them multiple deployments. They'd lost their families. They'd lost time with their families. They lost limbs. They lost friends. And now these are the guys that have to pick up the phone and the girls, and they're answering the phone and they're staying on the line while, a guy's wife is being tortured at a Taliban checkpoint, being beaten with a rubber hose, and he can hear her screaming. Imagine what that reawakens in these already, fractured individuals who've done so much for the country. And now you're putting this load on them, and now they've also carried it, Nick, for 4 years. They've stayed on the phone. It's like the world's longest 911 call.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you hang up the phone? If Mustafa had stayed on the phone with you and you were sending him, money to pay for a safe house because he can't show his ID, he can't feed
Mhm.
his kids. So you're helping him, you're raising money in your church. How do you hang up the phone on him? When do you tell him, I'm sorry, I can't help you anymore? I mean, when you have the kind of code that we have, you stay on the watch until properly relieved. And that's what our institutions have done to this wonderful generation of warfighters. They have they have given them the worst moral injury in modern history.
Mhm.
And I wonder if this new administration even understands that.
Well, I think that there's a good possibility, more so with Trump than certainly with the other option. Um, because if you look at just the people he surrounded himself with, Pete Hegseth, for example, phenomenal
Yep.
choice. In my opinion, he gets it. I like the idea personally of not having a 4-star general as a Secretary of
Oh,
Defense, having somebody that's kicked down doors
yeah,
in the
I,
war that just happened
I
and
do too.
understands these things.
Yeah, I do too. I do too.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, I think this incoming administration has the propensity to understand. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying this because they're tone deaf. I'm saying this because I don't think, I mean, even Pete, like I know Pete, and I've actually said this to Pete, but there's Pete and Waltz are about the only ones I know of. There may be a few more who actually lived it
Hmm.
and who know what these warriors are carrying.
Right.
And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that one of the things that at Task Force Pineapple that we're very adamant about and that I'm very adamant about in my body of work is helping this new administration understand that there has been a tremendous amount of trust and broken promises to our own community. And whether you were part of it or not, if you don't own it and set it right
Right.
publicly, you're never going to get them back. And if you don't get them back, you're not going to get their kids, nephews, and nieces back, which means you're going to continue to have a recruiting and retention problem.
I mean, it's such a great point because when you make that decision to join the military, there is a certain amount of trust that you have to give, right? You have to say, okay, they're not just going to throw my life away. I'm not just going to be disposed of in some war that nobody cares about. Unfortunately, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I was deployed to Iraq as well. I spent a year in Iraq, spent more time there actually, but um, these last 24 years, I'm like, man, were they meaningless? Did we do anything in this world other than kill some really evil humans that
Right.
are now we can talk about what they're doing now, but like, what is your perspective on that? I mean, you talk about moral injury. That has to be a key component of what people are thinking of. What did I just spend my last 20 years doing? Like,
Yeah,
what did I
it's a
just waste my time?
it's a great question, man. It's a great question, and it's a fair question, and I hear it all the time. Remember, we were doing our play Last Out, Elegy of a Green Beret before the the country fell.
Right.
And the reason that we were doing it was because I wanted to help Americans understand the impact of modern war, and I wanted to validate and heal those who lived it through storytelling, through theatrical experience. Because as a storyteller who had found storytelling in my transition when I nearly took my life, I had healed myself through storytelling, and I had
Mm.
experienced the emotional component of narrative to make sense of things that didn't make sense. And the modality of that
Hey,
is,
hey, Scott, could I zoom in on that a bit because
yeah,
it, I don't. I mean, you can share what you want to share. You're a grown man. Um, but I think that's. Can you maybe talk about that? Like you said, you almost took your life. I can't just zoom over that. I'd like to, if you're willing to talk about it, maybe
yeah.
like what you went through, or like what went through your head.
I am willing to talk about it now because I've lost so many friends to suicide from the war, and I've lost probably almost as many friends to suicide as I have in
Mm,
combat.
yeah.
And so I am willing to talk about it, and it's not it's kind of embarrassing, and it's something that I feel every time I talk about it I want to crawl under the desk. But it was in 2015, 18 months after I had retired. I found myself completely devoid of purpose. I had not dealt with any of my mental health issues from 3 tours in combat and losing a lot of friends and a lot of guilt, a lot of decisions that I had made that had, resulted in people leaving this world that I cared desperately about, and kids that I never meant to harm, things like that I didn't deal with. And then when you pile on top of that, the already moral injury of the way we had abandoned our Afghan allies with the Village Stability Program, and then coming home to a country that I didn't even recognize. I mean, as Sebastian
Mm,
Younger says, most
yeah.
combat veterans are willing to die for their country. They just don't know how to live for it, because it's hard to know how to live for a country that's tearing itself apart along every imaginable line, from race to religion to politics. And that's what I saw in 2013, 14, 15. And as you
Yeah.
said, I'm asking myself, what the hell would we even go over there for? I mean, we do all that fighting over there and give away our youth so we can tear each other apart here at home. I mean, like somebody comes up to you and says, thank you for your service, and then walks out the front door and beats the shit out of their neighbor with an axe handle. It's like, what is even happening right
Right.
now? And so it put me in a very, very dark place. And by 2015, I was standing in a closet holding a pistol, and had
Mm,
my son not come home from school when he did, I wouldn't be here. I can tell you right now. But he
wow.
did, and I walked out of that closet and never said anything about it. I just was humiliated, and I didn't want to live, and I didn't want to die. I just was in this purgatory, this transition purgatory, and I had lost my purpose, my identity, and I knew I still had something relevant to give. I really did. I
Right.
looked around at the division in the country, and I thought, man, I've spent my whole life in that churn of division.
Yeah.
I know what that is, and I actually know how to lead through that and how to help people make connections with rapport. And there's actually a science to it. But every time I would try to get in front of people, Nick, I would jam up. I would all that anxiety would come back,
Hmm.
and so one of my mentors, who was a business owner, said, there's a guy out in California that is a former NFL football player, blew his knee out, and he became an actor, then a playwright. Now he's a storyteller, and he helps guys like you reconnect with their struggle and repurpose it into a story that helps people. So I went out and worked with this guy, and he was amazing. Like, as soon as I saw him take the stage, it was like I knew exactly what I wanted to do. It was like I was a 14-year-old kid when I met my first Green Beret. It was that kind of feeling.
Right.
And so he started working with me on storytelling as a modality for self-healing. And then as I started to find my feet under me again, and I could say the names of my guys who fell, I could put a complete narrative around the isolated, white hot memories that I couldn't focus on or sleep around. Now, all of a sudden, there was a full narrative to go with it that made sense. And
Mm,
it was still emotional, but it wasn't white hot, if that makes sense.
yeah.
There was alignment with it again. And all of a sudden, then I started going, okay, well, so I started telling stories and sharing with veterans groups, and we started a nonprofit called the Hero's Journey, and we helped other veterans and family members and Gold Stars tell their stories. And at some point, I got completely crazy with it, like a typical Green Beret, and decided I wanted to be an actor and a playwright. And so I wrote this play about the war, and it was about a Green Beret team sergeant who's wounded and who ultimately bleeds out on the battlefield, but in the time it takes him to bleed out, operators come down from Valhalla and take him back through his life so that he can let go of what he's holding on to. And in that journey, you meet his family and his child and
Right.
the Taliban he hates, and so you go for the whole ride. And my point to all of that, Nick, is that storytelling saved my life at a very dark time. And it showed me that actually we're all story animals, and it became the mechanism that allowed me to reach out to other people and make an impact in the world, and change my life. Yeah, and it's really what I do today more than anything else, whether I'm talking about terrorism or mental health or
Hmm.
corporate leaders on how to like connect better. I do it all through storytelling.
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you for sharing that, and I think it's actually a sign of strength that you're able to sit there and share that. I could totally understand how that would be difficult, but I also think helpful for people that are probably feeling a lot of the same things you are. Um, I want, you mentioned something about um, basically, working with plays and kind of this more artistic storytelling. I want to kind of dive into that a little bit. But the idea of the warrior poet, I love this idea that it's the ultimate duality in life, right? You have the warrior at one hand and more artistic expression on the other. Are you familiar with Miyamoto Musashi?
I've heard the name, yes.
All right, I want to just read this little. It's a very short poem, because I when I was looking at you and like, okay, I'm going to talk with Scott. What do I want to talk about? I thought that this kind of stuck out to me because what you're talking about, like this fight, this personal fight that you have, stemming from your experiences. And this is a poem that he wrote upon his death. He's a famous Ronin samurai. He was known as like the best swordsman in the world. There's all these crazy stories about him.
Mm-hmm.
And this was his poem. He died in 1645. I compose my mind, drawing together the shadow and the light. Now I let go the sword and lean on no thing. And I look at the stuff that you're putting out, right? Like, nobody is coming to save you. And I'm like, he's a modern Miyamoto Musashi,
Wow,
right?
thank you.
The warrior poet.
Wow, thank you, man. That means a lot. I appreciate that. It kind of gets me a little emotional there. Only because I feel it in the sense that it's taken me 12 years to recognize that and to call myself an artist. Now, the level of how good I am as an artist, I don't know. But I do believe myself to be an artist. And I think it's important, or a creative, if you like. I mean, and I
Sure.
do think that for anybody out there, I think that there is a creative in all of us. I think that's divine in nature. Is that there in it? It varies in each of us what that creativity is. But I do think there is a creative spirit within each of us that if we can tap into it, it can save us. And it can not only save us, but it can give us the bridge by which we can repurpose our own struggles into the service of others. I call it the generosity of scars. In fact, if you Google my name and the generosity of scars TED Talk, there's a talk that I did shortly after one of my friends killed himself, and I talked about for the first time, and you can see it in the talk. This was 2018. I was in that closet in 2015. I didn't tell my wife, my kids, nothing until like 2 weeks before that TED Talk.
Mm.
So it was still very raw with me. But the point is, it allowed me to repurpose my struggle through that narrative. And I can't tell you how many people years later have come up to me and said, I stood in that closet too, man. And some of them military, some of them not. And the reality is, and this is where I'm going with this, Nick, is that in you talked about the book Nobody's Coming to Save You. The reason I wanted to write that book is because I feel like in these modern times, regardless of our industry, we've gotten away from our nature. That's one thing that Green Berets are pretty good at in our schoolhouses. We study human nature because we have to influence authentically in a low trust environment. So if you don't understand the art and science of human nature, it's very hard to do that on instinct. And
Right.
so I've studied it for a lot of years and with a lot of social scientists and neuroscientists. And so Nobody's Coming to Save You focuses on the enemy, which is the churn, all the division and low trust that we face today that's unprecedented. And the human operating system is the innate set of tools like the warrior poet
Mhm.
uses to bridge that churn and connect with people. And in Afghanistan, it was to move them up on rooftops to defend themselves. But here in the United States, or whoever's listening, it's an ability to build a resilient collective around a wicked problem. And if your interpersonal skills are good, and you really see the pictures in the head of the other party, you can do amazing things, regardless of title or class. And so, one of the things that I always say about the human operating system is that we are, if you look below our waterline, we're story animals. We've been telling stories for 70,000 years. The brain is a metaphorical pattern matching organ. It uses metaphor to make sense of the world, and it has a mandate to make sense, the
Mhm.
brain. And so, if you understand the mandate to make sense, and you understand that it uses story as a sense making tool, and you understand that 90% of your PowerPoint content is forgotten 30 seconds after you say thank you for your time, according to the
Right.
latest neuroscience study, then storytelling is not like a nice to have thing. It's a biological necessity, right? So why would you not stretch and train that muscle as a storyteller to go in and own every room you go into? But yet everywhere I look, man, is storytelling is just dismissed, and we've traded it out for this short form transactional BS that frankly people don't even listen to you for 3 seconds anymore.
I mean, that's very true. One things I've been trying to do more recently is actually like we were talking about connecting with people is to ask these more specific probing type questions as opposed to, hey, what do you do? Or, how was last week?
Right.
Is like to get into more like what was something really cool that happened last month? Like what was something that you were involved in that you're proud of? Like these types of probing questions that are more specific and get somebody saying, "Oh, wait a second. Like this is an actual real conversation. We're not just bullshitting here. Like this gives us an opportunity to talk about things that are important." Are there
Remember?
any are there
Yeah.
any like tools like that you would recommend?
Yes, totally. And again, and nobody's coming to save you. That whole book is chock full of what we're talking about here, just so you know.
Mhm.
And it's like a field guide for human connection. Like that's why it took me 6 years to write that damn thing. And it's a quick read, but it's just chock full of ways that you can make a human connection at a tactical level. Yep, that's it right
There you
there.
go.
And it's based on each chapter in the book is what I say is the human operating system is we are meaning seeking, emotional, social storytellers who struggle, right? And so each chapter, there's one chapter on meaning, there's one chapter on emotion, one on social connection, one on struggle, and one on storytelling. And the to your point, when you talk about asking questions. There's a couple of sources that I'll share with folks. And again, it doesn't matter if you're engaging your spouse or your boss or a client. Questionology, as Warren Berger in his book of beautiful questions says, is one of the best leadership and human engagement client facing tools we can use, particularly when things are ambiguous and complex and uncertain. The leaders who ask thoughtful, open ended questions that allow the other party to respond in narrative are the ones that are going to move people. Right now, you actually posed some really great sample questions. Another source that you can look at. So Warren Berger's book of beautiful questions is really great.
Right.
Another guy that I'm a big fan of his approach to questions is Chris Voss in Never Split the Difference, FBI
Mhm.
hostage
Yep.
negotiator. He calls them calibrated questions. And think about it. This guy's a hostage negotiator that's asking these questions, and it's life or death, right? He's
Right.
trying to build rapport. He calls it tactical empathy. Not crazy about that term, but you get the
Sure.
idea. And one other thing that he says about these questions, if you notice, both sample questions that you asked start with how. So if you can get thoughtful, in other words, pre-designed questions, if you're going to go meet somebody, you've already, like you said, you've gotten past where you're from, what do you like. If it's a key engagement, you want to have done that before you meet them. And then the questions you ask should be questions that start with what and how. And when I do that, I want to listen with pure discovery because the idea is I want to see the pictures in the head of the other party. And if I can see the pictures in the head of the other party, particularly as it pertains to their goals and their pain and their goals and their pain, then I'm going to be able to really connect with that other person in very short order. So I want to add, it's not just asking questions to ask questions. I'm asking questions so that I can see
Right.
the pictures in the head of the other party as it pertains to their goals and their pain.
That's awesome. And we'll share in the description all this stuff that you're talking about. Make sure everyone has links to all your books, all the books you're recommending. We'll put all that stuff in the description. So if you're on a podcast app or YouTube or whatever, we'll put it all in there. You'll be able to access that.
Great.
I think it's a great starting point to move into the discussion on kind of like where you're focused now on. You talk a lot about community. I was just on your LinkedIn Live for a little bit, and you're talking about what do we do to prepare for this next stage in the counterterrorism fight. One of the things that there's a lot of things that scare the crap out of me in regards to terrorism. One of the things I think about a lot, though, is the fact that we were over there for a long time. They had a lot of time to learn from us,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
They had a lot of time to learn from special operators.
Yeah.
We've had a wide open southern border for far too long. A day is too long, but 4
Yeah.
years is a lifetime. If they've infiltrated our southern border, which they have, and they've learned from us, from our operations in Afghanistan, do they not have access to the same TTPs that we use to recruit local communities? Can they not emerge themselves in local communities and use the same tactics that you're talking about against us? That's the thing that really scares me. It's not the one-off dude that blows himself up. That's awful and horrible, and I hope that doesn't happen. But the long burn, the long fight, the embedded special operations type support. And if you don't know, Green Berets, their entire thing is to go in with a small force and basically overthrow. They could go in with a small force and overthrow basically any mediocre government. I would say a strong government's probably a little bit harder, but that's their entire thing. And when I look at like these pro-Hamas protests,
Yeah.
right, or the kids who are idiotically praising Osama bin Laden, I'd like to get your reaction to that as well. That's what I think about. I'm like, these guys, they're online now. They're spreading this crap online. They're in the weeds. They're thinking about infiltrating communities, infiltrating societies with this ideology. I'll let you run with it.
Yeah, there's so much there to unpack.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot.
Yeah.
I know.
It's okay. I would start with, I recently gave a talk to on violent extremism, and I think the first thing is we have to realize that it's still a threat. There's been this shift over to the near peer thing, which I get it, but the dismissal of Islamist violent extremism, in particular Al Qaeda, ISIS, because we decided it was time to go. The enemy has a vote in what happens, and you're talking about an enemy who has a multi-century narrative of a global caliphate, and they're going to stop at nothing until they achieve that. That's just that there is no coexistence with the West. There is no Taliban 2.0. That is a diluted way of thinking, and as long as that narrative exists and people believe that narrative, then there will be a movement, and there will be not just capability. You can reduce that, right? You can reduce that with JSOC and other organizations, but it's essentially mowing the grass if the narrative remains strong. And I recently gave a talk to close to 1,000 Special Forces alumni at our annual convention, ranging from Korea to Vietnam to Just Cause to Iraq, Afghanistan. And I said, very frankly, how many of you think there's going to be an attack on the homeland in less than a year? And every hand in the room went up. 1,000 Green Berets from multiple generations raised their hands. And I thought I was ready to see that, but it took my breath away. Because a lot of these men have fought this enemy for 20 years. They know this enemy better than anybody. And I've also been, that's one part. So you got to take that. The next part you have to take is that this group of veteran volunteers who I described early on in our interview, right? The volunteers that were in Task Force Pineapple,
Right.
Moral Compass, and other groups, these individuals who were really mostly special operators and intelligence operatives during the war, very good at what they did. They are now getting this high fidelity information from intel operatives and special operators from the Afghan side who've retasked themselves, who already had access and placement as a measure of reciprocity, really, for these volunteers taking care of them and their families for 4 years. And so they're
Right.
getting this flood of high fidelity information on Mac tops and iPhones, for God's sakes. It's not classified because these are abandoned sources, mind you.
Yeah.
So it's not classified, but it's still with the same veracity that you would normally see with the three-letter agencies. Meanwhile, the three-letter agencies abandoned 99% of those human intelligence assets. They left them in the dirt. The DoD left over 30,000 commandos, special forces, Casca Tejas, NMRG, all left behind, right? And so all of them, plus the resistance, who are not being engaged by the State Department at all, are providing this information while the government, our government, your government, the State Department gives $87 million every 10 days to the Taliban for humanitarian relief, and if you can believe this, counterterrorism partnership to track ISIS.
What a joke.
So,
I mean, what,
yeah,
who's making these deals? I
that's
mean,
a big setup.
moron.
But this is where it's taking me, and this is why.
Yeah.
So the terrorism threat, that these volunteers unearthed a plot that has been going for multiple years now, even before Afghanistan collapsed, that was hatched by Osama bin Laden, I think like in '06, and it involves locally distributed complex attacks across multiple nodes where we live, work, and play. He actually executed a version of this with LET in Mumbai several years ago, and 10 terrorists, well trained in training camps, locked down a city of 19 million with hundreds of casualties armed with grenades and carbines. And so they've done it. Since the collapse in Afghanistan, Hamza bin Laden, who we thought was killed, the son of Osama bin Laden, is back in charge. The bin Laden brand is running Al Qaeda again. While our government says he's dead, and while our government says Al Qaeda is decimated, right? They're stronger than ever. They've infiltrated roughly 1,000 operatives into the United States and 1,000 operatives into Western Europe. And they are poised to strike. And they're going to strike very differently than what you saw on 9/11. It's going to look much more like October 7. In fact, many of the October 7 attackers, we know through reporting, actually trained in the very bases we were on in Afghanistan. Many of the fighters who flooded in to Syria trained in they're all under the umbrella now of what they call the Islamic Army. Even Iran has moved beyond the Shia Sunni differences and is participating in this. And meanwhile, we are completely asleep at the switch. And the last thing I'll say is I've been talking recently to Israelis who experienced October 7 because I think it's the best representation of what we're in for. And the one thing that they say towards the end, unsolicited every time, is they're like, Scott, you're trying to get a perspective on what you all are going to deal with at a community level. And I get that. But here's the thing I can't get my head around is we had a border. That border was heavily fortified. It was heavily watched. Our communities on the frontier are combat veterans. We have quick reaction forces. They caught us asleep and they decimated us. They had a limited time to get across the border and back. You all have had your border open for 4 years. They are among you. I believe your casualties will be 10x what we experienced. And so that's why we're so adamant, Nick, about this is that I believe that time's not on our side. I think we are in the midst of an advanced plot that probably we can't stop, only mitigate.
Well, obviously we don't want that to happen. What it's just there's so much here. You talk a lot about community. What are some very basic things that communities can do to just stop it, prevent it, identify the people that may take these types of actions? Is I don't believe in the throwing up your hands type deal, right? And
No,
I know you
no,
don't either.
no, I don't. But I also think it's important to recognize where you are in a planning and preparation and execution
Mhm.
stage, right? And so because it matters how you posture yourself. Um, and by saying I don't think we can stop it, it doesn't mean we can't mitigate and minimize.
Right, right,
And maybe we can stop it. But if we don't take that mindset right now and get really loud with the incoming administration, if we don't get in front of Pete Hegseth, Mike Waltz, President Trump, Tulsi Gabbard, Homeland Security Director, if we don't get in front of them and help them realize, look, you guys, what kind of transition brief do you think they got from the outgoing administration?
yeah, no,
Okay.
yeah, none.
Seriously.
Like
So what are they
garbage.
operating off of? If
Yeah,
the template for what the activity of the threat in Afghanistan is all residing in the private sector, when did that briefing occur?
didn't
It
right.
didn't. And so that's the
Yeah,
first thing I think that Americans can do is call your congressman and tell them to quit funding the damn Taliban. Call your congressman and demand that these global war on terror veterans be heard immediately on what they are trying to tell these agencies and institutions, right? We want our lives back. We want this shit off our MacBooks and iPhones, but we're
right.
not going to stop until we're responsibly relieved, right? And so there needs to be a responsible handover of this information at a private public level. And by the way, most of these sources are so low trust right now, they're not going to take a handler anyway.
Right.
So there's a
Yeah.
whole lot of work to be done. I think citizens need to demand that of their congressional leaders. Pick up a copy of Al Qaeda 2.0 on Amazon, read it. It's a quick read, and it will give you a really good synopsis, whether you have a background in the military or not, of this information, and you can make up your own mind. The other thing is we have a product called the Gathering Storm that's going to be coming out pre-order on Monday. And if you want, I can send you the link and you can
Yep.
share that, and all proceeds go back into Pineapple. But it addresses what you just said. What can communities do? The final thing I'll say is, if you just learn, for example, okay, reading Al Qaeda 2.0, looking at the Gathering Storm, it looks like the next attack on our homeland would likely look like October 7, and these are the ways that went down. Then look at okay, how does our community do mass triage? Is our sheriff's department clocking this? What would it take to systemically paralyze our first responders? Do we know who our ham radio operators are? Like, there's a whole bunch that you can
Right.
do. How strong is our community? Like, when's the last time we had a community watch meeting? You know, what would we do if this attack happened in the way that it's laid out in Al Qaeda 2.0 in this town, in this neighborhood? Where are our GWAT veterans? Who are our special operators veterans? Like, who do we have living in the
Right.
neighborhood? What are their recommendations? Like, there's so much we can do, but the problem is we don't even talk to each other anymore, right? We come home from work, we walk in the front door as fast as we can, hoping that a neighbor doesn't come knock on the door. And the fact of the matter
Yeah.
is we are so isolated that we don't even talk about this shit. And so I think you want to really do something is start reconnecting in your own community around this topic without the sky is falling mentality, but just start, hey, who
Right.
read this? Like, what do you think? And start rebuilding community connection, because that's it's a foregone conclusion that this will overwhelm first responders. It will. The ability for them to deal with this. If you look at the fires in L.A., look at the response in Western North Carolina after the hurricane. Nobody's coming in those first few minutes.
Right.
That's not a ding
Yeah.
on them. It's just designed that way.
From a intelligence perspective, I had a thought. Well, after I asked the question, I'm like, this is probably not a bad idea. On the intelligence side, we see a lot of things that normal Americans will never ever see. But I've always had this thought and sense, and I think most people in the intelligence community say, everything's overclassified. I mean, it's just
Way
overclassified.
overclassified.
You know,
Yeah.
you classify everything. Somebody sneezes, you write it down, it's classified. Um, there's a lot of information, and this is why I think what like Sarah Adams and you are doing is so interesting. There's a lot of information that if we just shared it with the public, people would be like, "Oh, they stopped that," because over those 20 something years, and hopefully still continuing today, we've stopped a lot of things from happening.
And
Plots that we had information on, we know who was involved, and we took action to prevent that from happening, but we never released that information to the public. We just hold it as if to say it's some type of jewel or something. It's not. It's information that should be released. I think the intelligence agencies should release a lot more of these operations, a lot more information about what happened, right?
I,
I
I,
think,
I agree.
that could be crucial.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting that you answered your own question about was it worth it, those 20 years, because the number of attacks that were stopped. But again, the American people in the West didn't even know. They weren't even tracking this. So they think, oh, we're
Yeah.
still over there after 20 years. What are we even doing over there? Well, we've interrupted how many plots, right? Like, and the reality is the world that we live in today, when you're facing an enemy with the will and capacity that Al Qaeda and ISIS has for an end of days scenario, what they have for a global caliphate, and what they're willing to go to, you're always going to be deploying and maintaining a surgical presence in these outlying areas where they set
Yeah.
up shop. There's no getting around that. And so there's always going to be a need to disrupt. But the thing is, you hit on something really critical here, is this ability to share information as well. The reality is, the other thing that so many of my Israeli friends told me in my interviews with them was this thing of hubris, this thing of arrogance, particularly, and I'm just going to say it, in the intel communities at an institutional level. The levels of hubris are astounding. I spent a year at Langley
Yeah, I'm
working,
with you. I'm with you.
and when like even the looks that we've gotten as veterans when we talk about this, they're like, "What are you even talking about?" Like just Hamza bin Laden's
Yeah.
dead. Okay, and I grew up in special operations where I was taught by some really good NCOs and some really good analysts that, competing points of view on intel is a good thing.
Right.
You don't just have one policy directed
No,
intel view and that's your view.
it's actually part of the standard.
Well,
The
it's not.
ODNI's analytic standards say you have to have multiple points of view. But
Well,
you're right, it doesn't happen. I
yeah,
think what
yeah,
does happen is when people move up in the ranks, they start to believe in their own hero, right? They start
yeah,
believing, oh, I'm the best, whatever,
right,
whatever. Um,
right, right.
but
But
that
I,
hubris, like you're talking about, missing.
and I guess that's the thing I'm trying to get at here is that right now, the preponderance of actionable information
Yeah.
that could actually serve in either prevention or mitigation resides in the private sector, in the veteran sector. It's Twilight Zone, I know, but it
Right.
doesn't it doesn't preclude the fact that we need to get it shared. It needs to be shared with our institutional
Hmm.
proponents, of course,
Yeah.
and somehow responsibly hand it off with them taking a non-hubris approach to it and actually, you know, embracing the GWAT veterans that have been
Hmm.
involved in this and bringing them into the fold in a psychologically safe way. But at the same time, and we're not waiting for the institutions either, by the way, it needs to be shared in a flat, coherent way with state and local leaders and community leaders because they're the ones we believe that are going to actually experience the manifestation of these attacks, right? And if history is our guide in the last several attacks, look at where it's been, where we live, work, and play, and not necessarily relegated to large cities. You've seen attacks
Right.
in smaller towns, smaller communities, and they know this. ISIS knows this, Al Qaeda knows this. They know they can evoke absolute horror and systemic paralysis of an entire nation if they hit a daycare in a town of 10,000 people and put it up on the webcams. They know this.
Yeah.
We can barely even think about it. We can't fathom 8 men willing to fight to the death. We've never experienced an IED here. We've never experienced complex IEDs here, but we're about to. And that's the thing is, will we get in front of this and get the mindset now? Or will it be a post 9/11, let's load them up on airplanes and go get some payback,
Right.
after the fact? And it all comes down to, I think, our ability to communicate with one another and flatten the landscape, because that's the X factor that these assholes, I don't think, can deal with, is 1.8 million GWAT veterans distributed across America who are well informed. You can't, I mean, look at what happened in Western North Carolina when the
Right. Yeah.
institutions and FEMA failed. Look at how fast those veterans got into those mountains with everything from helicopters to mule trains.
Yeah. It was an amazing response there, and I have a lot of friends in North Carolina, um, in particular in that region, and I had one friend that he was tasked to go locate bodies, and he actually found some bodies 35 feet up in trees in
Yeah.
Western North Carolina, and he said that the the support he received from like to go do this, he was tasked to do this by I think it was by FEMA. He received more support from just like local
Yeah.
dudes on the ground than the government. But I want to touch on kind of where I think it's really critical. Like you talk about these veterans groups and the GWAT people that are here kind of standing guard and ready. Maybe they don't want to be in that fight anymore, but
They don't.
there's no choice.
I don't.
Right. No, me neither. There's been a shift in the intelligence community. So in my career, I started as an intel person about 2002, right? So 20 something years. And the massive shift has been this deluge of open source intelligence, open source data, and commercially sourced data. The intelligence community as a whole is still kind of wrapping their heads around this. They don't have good policy in place for how can we use this information, who can use it, how can it be shared if you're purchasing information here and data here and we combine it together, is that classified? Like there's some massive problems going on in the intelligence community in regard to open source intelligence. And what it comes down to is people that are not in the government are better at open source intelligence than the government that is hamstrung by policy. There is no open source intelligence agency, right? It doesn't exist. Why not? We have a signals intelligence agency. We have a geospatial intelligence agency. We have a human agency, the CIA. Why don't we have an open source intelligence agency? There's so many common sense things that we could do to help this along, but I think it's vitally just important and interesting that open source intelligence by people outside of the government are providing better information than the CIA, or that I would have liked that these reports that you're talking about. Why couldn't the CIA release this to the public? Like you talk about trust, that would, or even if they were to say, you know what, Sarah, Scott, you guys are talking about some really important things. The CIA is behind you. We're going to publish this out, and we're going to tell the public we believe in this. This is true. We back this up. Like imagine the amount of trust that would establish. Just like working with normal citizens, it's a massive problem. Just this open source intelligence problem in the IC.
It is. And I'm not as read in on that as you are. And admittedly, I've been out of the game a lot of years, Nick. What I can say is this, in regards to what you're saying, is that we are going to have to deal with this private public reality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was just recently up I gave a keynote up in Boston, and there was an innovation center on the campus where I spoke, and it was the most impressive thing. It was, it was all around technology and innovation, and it was the nexus of the private sector, the intelligence world, DoD, special ops, industry, and they all worked in this incubator. And if you walked in this building, you wouldn't know. Like you would have no idea unless you were
Right.
read in on what they did. And it was so flat and so collaborative. And there's just so much collective acceptance that that's the fastest way to get really cool shit on the battlefield. Like that's
Yeah.
just where it's, and to get in front of your enemy. Like it's just accepted. No one's, in that incubator, no one's disputing parochialism. Like they know that it
Right.
is truly the starfish, as Ori Brofman and Rob Beckstrom talk about. It's not the spider, the hierarchy. We are going to have to figure out how, as you said, we're going to have to get to that same metaphorical reality with Intel. Because, like it or not, over the last 4 years, these GWAT Global War on Terror volunteers have picked up the steaming pile of crap that the institutions bailed on, and
Yeah.
they've not let go of it. Like they're still connected, and so they are your most viable resource. But yet, as you said, there's so much hierarchy, so many stovepipes, so much hubris that I really wonder, even with a new administration, if they will acknowledge and open the aperture to allow us to share with them what we're so eager to share
Right.
responsibly,
Right.
and get moving on this because it's really disturbing. It's
Mhm.
really disturbing, and I don't know. And the other thing is, honestly, Nick, I think a lot of senior leaders are so not read in on how fast things move these days and how things move
No.
on signal and how flat the architecture is, and frankly how fast these GWAT guys move. They're not tracking. They're from a different generation, and they can't get past the spider mindset of
Yeah.
the traditional hierarchy.
Yeah. I actually, what you're saying is 100% accurate, and I can attest to it because when I go, when I'm talking to people at the intelligence agencies or directors of offices and things like that, and I bring up things like this or some new technology that I've learned about, and I would think they're 100% tracking.
Yeah,
They live on their networks,
yeah,
right? In this is particularly in the intelligence community. I can't speak to the broader military community, but in the intelligence community in particular, they live on their networks, and they're not in they're almost in a different world than we are. Like I'm telling you, I go there, and it's like you're in a black hole because you're working in a skiff. Maybe you could hop on Nippernet, but all the work is happening on a different network. You're not getting this live news on X, which, by the way, is amazing at getting stuff out there. I almost want to check it right now to see if there's some new shit happening. Um, you're just not connected because you're in this bubble. And it's almost insane. It's almost insane. You talked about sharing some of this information, and I want to just talk about like what is that experience like going on the Shawn Ryan podcast and sharing that? You've been on there twice now, right?
yeah.
What's that experience been like? I've actually been connected with Sarah on Twitter, X, whatever, for a while, and I just noticed when she was on there recently, her Twitter following went from like 20,000 to like 200,000 like overnight because of Shawn Ryan. What's that experience been like for you? Just kind of obviously awesome, awesome dude, awesome show. What's that experience been like for you?
It's been amazing in the sense that Sean Ryan is, I think, has done more to disrupt information, uh, actionable information, and bringing information to folks in the everyday
Hmm.
than probably anybody in media history. I think he's far advanced beyond Joe Rogan or any of these others because he he doesn't just put interesting people on his podcast. Like there's a lot of times there's an actionable arm to it, and he's
Mm.
invested. He follows up with it. He puts his own neck out there, and he's the first person I've ever seen do that. And I'm very grateful to him for having done this around this problem set because frankly, until he brought, I'd been on with him once with Pineapple, and it had moderate exposure. But then when Legend came on, and then Shawn and I went to Vienna together and interviewed Masood, and then Sarah came. Sarah had been on already, and it just snowballed, and it became. I think a lot of people, there are a
Mhm.
lot of people across the country like yourself who just didn't feel right about the way the war ended, didn't feel right about what we were opening, exposing ourselves to, but didn't feel like they had a voice. Shawn gave them a voice, right?
Yeah.
And he continues to do that. So that part of it has been great. What has not been great, and I told Shawn this, and I'll tell your viewers and listeners this, and I don't mind. This ain't what I had planned for my life at 56 years old. Like I'm serious.
Right.
I have a business that I'm a public speaker. I teach human connection skills. I'm more about reciprocity and rapport and storytelling and restoration. Those are the things that at 56 light me up. My kids are grown. I'm probably not that far from grandkids. I want to chase my wife around the house, of 29 years and just not fade away, but I'm kind of done with execution videos
Right.
and doing a line of work that I left 12 years ago because I didn't like where it was going. And now I've been relegated to it. And a lot of people feel this way in this volunteer community where I've hundreds of thousands of dollars have been spent. I've a
Mhm.
lot of stuff has been resurfaced in me again. There's my health's in and out. And so this is not something I'm looking to do for the rest of my life. I'm ready to hand this off and no kidding, get this shit off my MacBook and iPhone so that I can go get a new device
Yeah.
and live my life, and I know I speak for a lot of veterans and a lot of Intel alumni who feel this way. And so that part of it has not been great because I have the attention of the Taliban now. I have the attention of Al Qaeda now.
Mhm.
And that's fine. Like whatever, I hate those fuckers, but th- that's that's not where I plan to be at 56.
Right.
But if that's where my higher power puts me, then so be it. But I'm just being candid. Like there's two sides to it. For me, I I like Shawn as a friend. I don't need his platform. I don't. Like I leverage his platform because he and I both know it's the right thing to do. But I don't know. That's what it's been like. That might not be a politically correct answer, but I don't care.
Yeah. More duality from Scott Mann. That's what we get.
Yeah,
Uh,
like Sybil.
yeah, man. So, um, what I love about Shawn Ryan and others, and really it's about this new media landscape. Is we say trust is at an all time low, but that's not really true. Trust in certain individuals, I think, is at an all time high. I think some people like Joe Rogan have a whole lot of trust, right? I think organizations like Congress have no trust at all. But I think what is the reason I think that is because now podcasting and technology has allowed people that have actually accomplished shit, like Shawn Ryan, that are actually accomplished human beings, and they also happen to do this podcast thing. I think it makes it so much more potent than just hearing news or information from someone that graduated from journalism school and is now a flapping head on TV. Not
Yeah,
that that's not a fine profession, sure, but hearing from people that have world experience and the things that they're talking about and have perspectives based on experience and success, like that is what I think is so powerful and what builds um, this new media landscape set on trust of individuals, not on trust of organizations. Nobody
I
trusts
love it.
CNN, right? But you might trust a dude on CNN,
Right.
Scott Jennings, probably the only one. Uh, um, but I think that's what I really like about Shawn Ryan and some others out there. They're actually legit accomplished humans. Um, I want to maybe jump over a little bit. You talk a little bit about um, storytelling. I know you've transitioned from the military. You've been out for how many years now?
12.
12 years. Okay. All right. And I know you don't want to go back into the fight, but you're kind of driven by the need. I always have this I don't mantra. I don't know. It's not a mantra, but the question that I ask myself sometimes is, who is they? Right? When
Mm.
when we see problems in the world, a lot of times people just say, "Oh, they need to fix that.
Oh yeah,
They need to fix that."
yeah,
Who is they? They is you, right? Like they is it's a personal responsibility to fix problems in your community, problems in your country, problems in the world. You have um, a saying that I want to dive into a little bit. Um, it's "see you on the rooftop." I wonder if maybe you could tell me about that a little bit. Like, where did that emerge from, and like, what do you mean by that?
yeah. Well, it speaks to what you're talking about in Afghanistan, in particular, in 2010. Maybe a little earlier than that. We looked around and we realized that we were losing the war. There were more Taliban in the rural areas of Afghanistan than when we started in '02, and we really needed a new approach. We had been working off of fire bases and kicking in doors and rolling on targets for almost a decade. And what it had done is it had actually created this churn in these environments where there was so much just distance
Hmm.
between even the special forces teams. I mean, there were a few that had good rapport. I mean, all of them had good rapport, but it was usually to allow them to roll on a target, right? But like the actual capacity of the communities was negligible. And that's the key, right? If you're
Yeah.
fighting a rural insurgency, the community has to be the antibody to the insurgent, to the bad actor. And that wasn't happening. And so we realized that, and we realized that we were also on the clock at that point. They had put an exit timeline, and so we needed a new strategy. So a handful of us were selected to design and implement an approach that would get us back to our roots, really based on the special forces CIDG program in Vietnam, where they
Hmm.
worked with the Montagnards in the Central Highlands and had them, great fighters, and had them fight back as communities. And it was very successful. So we called this program Village Stability Operations. And basically, we would move into one community at a time, one little ODA. They'd live on their trucks for, 3 weeks outside the community. Like it was an
Yeah.
all in thing. They'd leave their fire base, packed on their trucks, and they'd literally camp outside the community. And that it's kind of like we learn in the SF school. You have to basically gain entry into the community, and it was not easy
Right.
after 10 years of door kicking, particularly the ones that were infested with Taliban. But eventually they would get their way in there, and then they'd make three promises to those villagers. They'd say, "Look, we're not. If you don't want us here, we'll leave. If you work with us, it's going to get harder before it gets any easier. And these thugs down the road, they're going to come for us and for you guys and your kids. And three, when they do, we're going to go up on the rooftop and we're going to fight them." Like whether you do or not, if you let us live in this community, our promise to you is every time those guys come, we're going up on the roof and we're going to fight. And I heard it's just like over and over again, every community, that's what would happen. Within a day or so,
Right.
they'd get attacked at night, and the villagers would stay down in their hooches, terrified. The team would roll out, get up those bamboo ladders, and they'd return fire. Oftentimes having to just take effective fire because they were firing from another compound that they knew had innocent people on it. And so this would go on for you know a couple of weeks, couple of months, and then during the day, when these guys would come down, they'd go out and engage villagers. They'd work out, understand their hydrology problems, their low tech agriculture problems, help them resolve disputes, and gradually build that social capital when the risk was low, and then they'd go back up when the risk was high. And at some point, every single time in one of these communities, Nick, like the guys would be duking it out, and there'd be a muzzle flash off to the left on another rooftop, and it wouldn't be their team. It'd be a farmer that had made a decision to finally go up there, after seeing this happen, and just defend his own home. And usually that would be the catalyst moment. Within a couple of weeks from there, you'd have three roofs, five roofs, 10, until the whole village is just pouring rifle fire back into the threat the way they had always done,
Right.
what they were designed to do. And when I would I was a program lead for that. So I would bring congressional leaders and politicians and admirals out to see it, and I would tell the story as they were looking. I would call it rooftop leadership. And it's just that ability to move people up onto a proverbial rooftop when they're scared, when they're angry,
Right.
when they're tired. And they don't do it because they have to. They do it because they choose to. Anyway, they go anyway. And it's usually built on social capital, that trust that you built when risk was low and leverage when it's high, and modeling what it looks like even when everybody else doesn't move persistently.
Right.
And I fell in love with that approach to leadership. And I when I got home and saw this churn here at home, same kind of churn, I just thought, okay, well, what if we could create a rooftop nation here? What if rooftop leadership could be the way that we lead our families, our communities, our businesses, kind of from that bottom up type
Mhm.
approach, and one roof at a time. And so but it's all around purpose and human connection. And so that's what I've been doing for 12 years.
I love that. I didn't understand where that term came from, and all the leadership stuff. Um, there's a lot of people that exit the military and they get into like leadership consulting and things like that, which I think is great because that perspective is just you can't beat that perspective having that experience. Um, but I really like what you're doing in terms of how you're focused on storytelling and focused on connecting with other veterans and people that participated in kind of the same campaigns you did and kind of helping them work through things. Can you maybe talk about what the importance of storytelling and maybe more importantly, like the impact that it's had, like improving your storytelling, like the impact that that's had on your life?
Oh man. Yeah, a lot. I mean, first of all, it saved my life, as we discussed. It
Right.
gave me, because, again, the way I like to do it is because there's always a lot of skepticism around storytelling, kind of bedtime for Bonzo and I'm okay, you're okay kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
that's not what we're talking about here. You go back to the fact that the brain is a metaphorical pattern matching organ, and the brain has a mandate to make sense of the world. So the brain uses narrative metaphor as a way to make sense of things. And so it has a mandate for story. And if we will tell ourselves a story on every new piece of information that we come across. That's why you're the protagonist in your own story every moment that happens in your life. So you're living a story every moment. That's how the brain processes new information. Your brain is filled with neural story maps, right? That's why, like, if you find out that there's an organizational change where you work right now, Nick, you'll be like, oh God, here we go. And because you'll revert back to that neural story map from the last time they did that and it kicked your ass and it
Right.
caused you all these problems. Like, that's a story. So, you know, what I learned through storytelling and how it affected me was, one, just taking the coaching and saying, okay, do this, Scott, and this will help you heal. And so it helped me heal myself. But then from there, what I saw was that storytelling is a way to bridge these trust gaps that are out there. Because what happens, the biology of storytelling, what happens is when you share a story about your lived experience, right? So let's just say it's 10,000 years ago and we're sitting around the fire and I stagger into the fire pit where everybody's sitting, yourself included, and I say, all right, let me tell y'all why saber-toothed tigers make shitty pets. And I'm all bloodied up and everything.
Right.
Every round around the fire is like this.
Right.
Like, you go into a trance and you're listening as if your life depends on it, because our brain knows when a story is in play, and we literally go into a trance. Our energy and focus changes and we're in full absorption mode. And the reason is because biologically we've learned over 70,000 years that by the time that saber-toothed tiger story is over, and you see the emotion that I bring to it, and I'm maybe even crying, and you see the struggle and how I overcame the struggle, it's as if you lived it yourself. You felt the cuts on your skin. You
Hmm.
felt the knot in your stomach when you realized it was turning on you, and you felt the elation when I overcame it, right? And you literally felt, and now they call that autobiographical listening,
Yeah.
or narrative transportation. You literally locate yourself in the story, and you are now processing your own lived experience in the safety of that narrative. Fast forward, 10,000 years, I'm telling a story on my dad's battle with cancer. and how he overcame his third battle with cancer and how it taught him the importance of legacy and leaving tracks. And you're listening to that, except now you're not thinking about my dad. You're actually thinking about someone in your family who had cancer. Or you're thinking, man, I hope I don't get cancer. But you're processing your own lived experience autobiographically in my narrative. And what that does at the end of the day is it elicits the most powerful reciprocity in the world. It accelerates trust, and you're now connected on a subterranean level. And that's what storytelling has done for me. I can go in pretty much any room on the planet, and I can either ask questions that let you tell me a story, or I can share stories with you in the service of you. And it's going to accelerate our connection. And we're going to leave there with a better perspective with each other and probably postured to get more shit done. And I call that narrative competence, the purposeful storytelling in real time to meet your goals. That's what it's given me. And it's at the epicenter of everything that I do and teach.
So for can you maybe talk about what you're doing with your leadership consulting, and is that connected to the storytelling? Is it connected to some of the other things that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that question, Mike. So, there's an old saying in business, particularly with guys like myself who are small business owners, and
Mhm.
is that your name is your brand. And I finally got
Yeah.
over myself and bought into that a few years ago. And so, Scott
Yeah.
Mann is my brand. And within that body of work, I do nonprofit and for-profit work. All of my nonprofit work is done through Task Force Pineapple, right? And that's where we work and we focus on national security stuff, like we've talked about, and advocating for our allies, advocating for our veterans, and helping all of them tell their story. So that's that part of my world. And it's a big chunk of my world. The other
Mhm.
part of my world is what I call rooftop leadership. And that's where I teach and train and speak on the power of human connection in the private sector. And I help leaders at all levels become rooftop leaders that become better at their interpersonal connection skills, better storytellers, better active listening, but improve your sales
Mhm.
team by increasing your empathy skills. And so that's that side of what I do as well. And then I would be remiss to say that, like, also a big, the third leg of that stool is I'm an artist. I love to create things. I write plays, I write stories, I write films. I am an actor myself. So the artistry, the creativity side feeds both of those flagships, and it gives me peace. It gives me a grounded place in this world. And so that's my body of work, and all of it resides at scottmann.com. My books, my plays, my workshops. One thing I will say, if I could, is I don't know if you've ever heard of the platform School, Skool. But it's pretty neat. It's fairly new, and it's
Mhm.
designed. It's an online platform, and it's designed. It's their words. It's to democratize learning. So, like, if you want to learn the guitar, if you want to learn,
Right.
sales techniques, how to build your own business, leadership, storytelling, you can get in there without all the BS bureaucracy and just learn from. It's I think in a lot of ways a lot more affordable than master class and not as
Right.
polished.
Right.
It's more like in the trenches. And I learned about it, and I'm building a whole platform now on School around what we've talked about so that folks can go learn how to bridge trust or how to tell their story, for a couple $100 with me, and not come to a live event and spend a couple thousand. And so that's the new thing that I'm breaching into now. Is because at 56, man, I just want to pour myself into people, and I want to make 30 years of my body of work available to them so they can get big stuff done and they can create their own movements and build better relationships. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but all of that's
100%.
resident
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
scottmann.com.
Yeah. No, that definitely answers my question. Um, you mentioned that you talk with business leaders and um, various leaders from different organizations. One of the biggest things that we struggle with as a business owner, myself, and working in all these different remote locations, is how do you build connectivity, like real connectivity, in this modern world that we're living in?
What a great question. I just did a poll on LinkedIn and I asked, like, you may have seen me talk about this on the live. but something like 41% of those 200 and some people that I polled that
Hmm.
answered it, that's their question. That's their concern
Hmm.
is how do you bridge those gaps in this modern world? And particularly when you consider what a hybrid world we live in, right? I mean, so much is on Zoom and remote meetings, and it feels
Yeah.
like we're so disconnected in so many ways, yet we're hyper connected at the same time, but it's
Right.
thumbnail thin. And I think the first step that I tell people is, well, yeah, I'm being a little bit biased here, but you should definitely pick up a copy of Nobody's Coming to Save You, and
Sure.
you should read the Human
Read it.
Operating System, because if you understand the human operating system, and you understand that we're meaning-seeking, emotional, social storytellers who struggle, we're 250,000-year-old, well-dressed Neanderthals. It's not. It hasn't changed, and if you those things are typically invisible to us in the modern rat race. I use the iceberg as a methodology to understand the tip of the iceberg's the modern world that you're talking about. And it seems like it's all consuming, like it's the only part of our world that exists. But the reality is the rest of the iceberg is the traditional world. It's the ancient world, the hunters, the gatherers, and it's still in our DNA. And it's 90% of who we are, meaning seeking, emotional, social storytellers who struggle. And so even if you're going to connect online, even if you're going to do like what you're doing here, the reason that you're able to host your podcast very well, and you're a great interviewer because you do your homework. You dig in, you learn ahead of time, you actually respect the other party, and you have pure discovery in your mind when you connect with them. That's below the waterline kind of stuff. If we're going to thrive in technology, we've got to be able to put a foot down below the waterline and tap into our primal selves. We have to have an innate understanding of who we are as that primal creature, and then let that inform what we do in the modern world. So, in other words, being on Zoom or Twitter or X is not an excuse to be a shitty storyteller or a bad listener, right? And if you act tribal on X, it's still tribal. And if you unfriend someone on Facebook because they don't like your candidate and they're a 20-year friend, that's just as tribal and just as dangerous as doing it in the real world, if not worse. So
Mhm.
I think that's the key is we've got to get back to our nature. We've got to get a cognizant, coherent understanding of the human operating system and then let that inform what we do in all this technology.
That's brilliant, Scott. I love that.
Thank you,
Like
bro.
what you just said, it was really brilliant. And I haven't quite heard that spin on. I've asked this question before, not on a podcast, but to other people, because it's something that we struggle with as a company. And I want to connect with my employees. They're all over the world. I want to connect with them, and I want to know what's going on in their lives. I want to hear from them. I want them to be like, hey Nick, like my daughter's sick today. Like I want to know that stuff, right? This
Yeah.
is important to me, and it's hard to build that trust remotely, right?
Right.
I try to share stuff. So that's definitely a struggle for me. Um,
I would tell you this real quick, man. Just
yeah,
I'll recruit you right here online.
let's do it.
March 1 and 2, own every room. I run a workshop at a dude ranch in Florida between Orlando and Tampa, and it's
Okay.
a small gathering, mostly business owners and nonprofit founders, and it's the only like live training I do in person. But we get together and I teach for 2 days how to be more relatable to pain, relevant to goals, and to tell your story. Tons of reps with other business owners, other industries, and it is badass. It's called Own Every Room. You would be great at it. You should think about coming and training with me at some point.
I'm in. I'm there, and everybody listening to this should go too. But not too many of you. I don't want to deal with too many of you. But I'm down, Scott. I'm totally down for that. Um, we're everything we talked about, all the resources, tools, things like that. They'll be in the description. Definitely check that out. Scott, I don't want to just wrap up right away. I have a couple more questions for you that I think
Sure.
are just critical right now. What do you believe is America's greatest strength? Um, and the reason I'm asking you this question, it's not just like some willy-nilly question. It ties into a lot of the stuff that we talked about. I think I know there's been a decline in patriotism in our country. You can see it in polling. But I still think that we're an exceptional nation. I recently did a podcast with Glenn Tippert. He's from the Hoover Institute. He works directly for Condoleezza Rice. He's one of the absolute best experts in the world on China. And we talked a lot about struggles between U.S. China relationships. And I've posted some stuff on some of the platforms, and the comments that I get from American citizens, Jamie in Tennessee or Brett in Wyoming, like you can see it in their usernames. I mean, yes, it could be all nonsense bots or whatever too, but there's a lot of them, so certainly there's some truth to it. There's clearly this anti-patriotic sentiment that I think primarily exists. I don't want to say for certain, but for sure on more left-leaning thinkers, that America's evil. America is, a war-seeking nation. That's all we want to do is dominate and, go for the oil, and we want to perpetuate wars with other countries. We want to perpetuate proxy wars. Like, you see it in the comments as just like things that are clear that people don't quite understand what America really is, the values that America really has. So that's the basis for the questions. What do you believe is America's greatest strength?
In the I think it was in the 1800s, a guy named Alex de Tocqueville came over from France to try to get his eyes and his head around this experiment called democracy, liberal democracy, federalist republic in America, and to try to report back to his superiors. And what he found, he was astounded by this experiment that was over here. And when you think about the fact that most civil societies on the planet are actually very draconian in a lot of ways, they're very tribal, and that that's our nature. Like as mammals, we are in-group, out-group, scarcity-dominated, fear-dominated creatures, and it's only in the last, couple hundred years that certain civil societies have evolved socially into this, this trust that you talk about that actually bridges beyond one's in-group, which is a very rare thing, very rare. It's very difficult to create a civil society where that's possible. And in other societies where it's not possible, then what happens is the group is at the epicenter of everything, right? So it has to be, because that's how you acquire food. It's how you maintain your resources. It's how you survive. And therefore, the group is above the individual. The individual, if you live in rural Afghanistan, it doesn't matter what you want to do for a living. It doesn't matter what your dream is. Your inherent obligations are to your clan, your tribe, your quam. Like, that's how it is. Right? Because the group is everything. Even your status as a human is considered within the context of your circle, period. We are status creatures by our very nature. And there's even elements of that in the United States. But what de Tocqueville found that was so interesting in the United States, he wrote of this thing, and Robert Putnam really highlights this in Bowling Alone. He says, de Tocqueville said Americans, they have this really unique look of individualism rightly understood. Individualism rightly understood. In other words, even our constitutional founding documents put the onus on the individual, not the group, which goes against everything of our biology. So there's this elevated sense of like the individual, so you can pursue anything you want. Your dreams, your hopes, and not only that, it's preserved by the state. Right. But it's rightly understood. In other words, there's still a sense of community. There's all the good things from that traditional society, and there's a lot good about what's below the waterline and where we come from. Storytelling, long-form communications, empathy, reciprocity, honor, It's rightly understood that there are elements from our past that must be preserved. For example, liberals and conservatives have been living together for thousands of years. There have been liberals and conservatives coexisting and working toward shared future for thousands of years. It's only in the advent of these dopamine dispensers that we've started speaking with contempt for one another that we would normally reserve for our enemies. And so I believe what makes this country unique is our individualism rightly understood, but we're failing to understand it right now, and we're thinking that it's just an inherent right that we have, that it's like it's just an entitlement. This thing we call individualism, and I can just be as individual as I want. Screw you, right? If it feels good, I'm going to do it, even if it's at your expense, right? That is a bastardization of that concept, and it's taking it to the extreme. And there's a lot of factors that I call the churn that are doing that. But at the end of the day, what I believe we've got to try to return to is this notion of individualism rightly understood, informed by a sense of community and social capital that preserves that rights of the individual, but not at the expense of others, right? And we learn and we live and we coexist and we find ways to do that. Not in a kumbaya kind of way. I'm okay, you're okay, but like in a practical way that we've actually been pretty good at and that other countries came and took note of. There's actually precedent for it. But we got to get back to it. And it starts, again, I think, by getting reacquainted with our nature and understanding what makes us tick and respecting that and then working within those operating systems.
That's brilliant. In there, what I heard was that Tampa needs a new mayor. I'm just saying, Scott. What
Nope.
I heard that there's an opening there. Somebody needs to
Yep.
be rescued by those soft guys every year in the harbor, right?
Yeah. I think that a lot of us can do, I have tons of respect for guys and girls that go into politics. And, my days, I think, of a formal title are probably over. I really think I can do more without a title than with. But I appreciate the sentiment.
Um, I'm only half joking, and I don't mean it particularly just for you, but I mean by and large, I'd like to see more and more veterans
Yeah.
going into
Yeah.
politics. Um, I like the idea that people that actually know what the world looks like
Yeah.
have a really good understanding of what the true nature of the world is,
Yeah.
making decisions, right?
Yeah.
Whether that's left or right, it doesn't, to me, it doesn't matter. I like the idea of having someone that's served and said, okay, I understand what this thing is. I understand what it means when we marshal our forces to go to a different country or whatever. Yeah. I like that idea as a whole. So
Yeah.
I'm all for it, man. You got my endorsement. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you.
You talked a lot about this individualism, and I love that, and I think that's absolutely true and correct. That's what America's all about. Where do we? What's next for you in terms of what you're going to focus on as an individual? Like what do you see in your future? And I know it's hard to predict. I mean, you've kind of had this wild ride, in my opinion, just from an outside perspective of the things that you're working on. I think you've taken on a tremendous amount of personal responsibility to go fix things in the world. But what's next for you? What do you think is the next part of your story?
I'd really like to. I appreciate the question, Nick. I'd really like to help the new administration connect with the private sector of GWAT veterans and Intel alumni who have held the line, and I'd like to support whatever needs to happen to get in front of this terror threat. I really feel like everything else is less important than that. There's nothing more important than that right now, and I hope that in the coming weeks and months we can do that. And I fully intend to put my voice. And I think Shawn Ryan feels the same way as Sarah and others. We're going to get loud. And I ask people watching this to get equally loud. Call your congressman, call your senator, demand that we reawaken our focus on this terror threat, for the sake of your families and our communities. That's number one. I'd really like to, and the other thing is I'm going to continue. I'm working on a play that is going to be about the Afghan evacuation. It's a one-person play. Real excited about that. Um, and so,
Are you going to be the one
yeah,
person, or are you going to
yeah,
have somebody else?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That'll be coming out within a year or two, I think. And then finally, I'm really, really excited about this school platform
Yeah.
of putting my content out on this platform where people can access it and train wherever they are on this very important skill set, whether it's telling your story, whether it's asking questions that allow you to get more connection with your client, or, just to bridge a trust gap in another country, or to even just use diaphragmatic breathing to help your daughter who's been bullied on Instagram, bring her emotional temperature down. I'm
Mm.
all about equipping today's leaders to become rooftop leaders the way that I was equipped to do that in Afghanistan and other places, and to share that body of work. That hold and to do it through storytelling. Man, that fires me up so much. And I'm honestly just hoping we can deal with this terror threat in a way that I can get into that full time and then just do that and chase my wife around the house.
Well, cool, man. Well, we'll leave it there. Everything we talked about will be in the description. We'll make sure we have all the links to everything Scott's talking about. Definitely go grab his new book. Nobody is coming to save you. It's awesome. I haven't had a chance to read it, but I've glanced through a few of the chapters, and I can just tell it's gonna be a long night for me reading this thing.
Let me know
Um,
what you think, Nick. And I'm serious about you
yeah,
coming to train with us. I'd love you to come be a part of our workshop. I think you'd really enjoy it.
I think that'd be great. I love to come down. I love going to Florida. I love coming to the Tampa
Nice.
region.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm always there anyways for
Yeah.
work purposes.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I'd love to meet you. And
it
we culminated around a fire pit. We do the storytelling around a fire pit. So it's really, really neat.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Are you going to capture some content there too? Hopefully.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So definitely be on the lookout for more content from Scott. Check out his website. Check out his new podcast coming out. He's going to have
Yeah.
it with Sarah Adams.
Yeah.
That's going to be freaking awesome. I can't wait to see that
Yeah.
and listen to that. And just appreciate you being on, Scott.
Yeah. Yeah. Scottman.com. Hope you guys check it out. Thank you, Nick.
All right. Take care.